Welcome, everyone. We're just waiting on some others to file in here, and we'll get started momentarily. Hi all, we're dealing with some technical difficulties here, but we will be starting shortly, and we'll speak to you soon. Alrighty, let's get started here. Hello everyone, and welcome to Understanding New York Rates and Value Streams for Energy Storage Systems. My name is Samantha Leroy. I'm a project consultant at ERS. ERS is an outreach and technical assistance contractor for NYSERDA's energy storage program, and we're thrilled to be hosting this webinar today alongside NYSERDA and USGBC New York Upstate. We're hoping to have about 50 minutes of content here and 10 minutes of questions for everyone. So if anyone has a question to ask, you can use the question module on your GoToMeeting menu to type it up and send it our way. So many thanks again to Tracy Hall at USGBC New York Upstate, as this webinar is available for AIA Credit, course number USGBC NYU_NYES. Credits will be earned on completion of this course and will be reported to AIA CES for AIA members. We'll be giving instructions on how you can report your AIA number to Tracy shortly. So we're all pretty familiar with course description, so we're going to jump into the learning objectives here. Learning objective 1 is to identify opportunities for peak shaving and demand response and how and when to effectively stack these two value streams. Objective 2 is become familiar with funding streams, implementation support, and technical assistance offerings available. Objective 3, learn how to interpret a building's characteristics and load profile to determine whether an energy storage system will be beneficial. And learning objective 4, compare the benefits of various rate structures and learn how to choose the best fit for the building type and location. So again, in order to obtain AIA credit after the webinar, it would be helpful if you were to log into the webinar with your full name. After the webinar, you're going to email Tracy Hall with your AIA number and with the subject line, Energy Storage Webinar, AIA Credit Request. Tracy's contact information will be given again in this presentation and can also be found in the webinar reminder emails you received yesterday. All right, Tracy, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk a bit about USGBC New York Upstate.
Great. Thanks so much. It's really an honor to be able to partner with NYSERDA and ERF for delivery of important education information like this. I've been involved with USGBC almost since its inception in 2000, and I've served as the director since 2006. As you can see on the screen, the upstate is a bit of a misnomer because we cover 55 counties in New York. So if you're counting, that's everything except for Manhattan and Long Island and the boroughs. We strive to educate, advocate, and celebrate green buildings. We have a number of resources and tools. Most of you are probably familiar with LEED, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And I've put some information on the screen there, directions to our website. Also, if you'd like to sign up to receive information about other educational webinars and live in-person events, I have a link on screen to register to join our listserv. We also are a membership-based organization, individuals who volunteer and help us to promote green buildings and all that are involved. So thank you very much for partnering with us and looking forward to the webinar.
Excellent, Tracy. Thank you so much. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce Ben Falber of NYSERDA's Energy Storage Program, and he's going to talk to us a bit about energy storage currently in New York State.
Great. Thank you, Sammy. So this is Ben Falber from NYSERDA here. So just to provide some context on this webinar today, about a year ago, Governor Cuomo set a target for 1,500 megawatts of energy storage by 2025. In order to actually achieve that target, NYSERDA, working with DPS and other stakeholders, released the Energy Storage Roadmap last June. Based on the recommendations on the roadmap, the PSC issued an order just this past December, implementing the governor's directive and a legislative authority to set that 1,500 megawatt goal by 2025 and a 3,000 megawatt goal by 2030 of energy storage, and that's a power capacity target. The order addresses a number of things in addition to these targets on how we're going to achieve that. Goes into a lot of detail about various barriers, rates, tariffs, utility programs, procurement mechanisms, working with local governments, data access, a variety of things. One of those key elements is an incentive program. So the order approved a $350 million incentive program to deploy energy storage statewide. And the idea of this incentive program is to really accelerate the market as a bridge through 2025. So today, there's approximately 60 megawatts of advanced storage on the grid. We're looking at 1,400 megawatts of pumped hydro. And if you're curious to see a map and a list of all the storage installed in New York at the moment, we provided a link on this slide, which captures everything that both NYSERDA has funded and everything throughout the state. So in addition to the incentive program, which we'll provide a lot more detail on at the end of this webinar in the last few slides, but in addition to that, there's a lot of technical assistance type activities that NYSERDA undertakes. This very webinar is one of them. In addition to that, we've been doing a lot of work on siting, both permitting and interconnection, working with utilities, working with local governments, particularly in the downstate area in New York City. This webinar itself falls under the customer assistance category. We also have a variety of these types of events, guides, fact sheets, webinars, a lot of one-on-one technical assistance resources, modeling resources, site visits, things like that for industry. And we also, on the back end, do a lot of quality control on the sites that we support. And you can see a lot of the results of that site control and quality assurance on that DER map that we just talked about on the previous slide. So I'll leave it there. I think once we get back into the incentive program, I'll turn it over to Sammy, who's going to provide a really high-level technology description of just energy storage, just very generally, which will be followed by an examination of how standalone systems can provide bill savings for a customer. And I think it's important to just sort of take this information in the broader context that this is sort of a single use case and that storage has a lot of grid benefits to the entire network, to the entire utility system for reducing peak load and for integrating renewables. And even within on-site could be integrated with a lot of different renewables, but this is sort of a starting place and a way to really think about the financial component of an energy storage installation behind the meter.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And I just want to quickly note, we've seen a lot of links so far in the slides. Everyone who did register for this webinar will be receiving a copy of the slides after we're done here. So don't fret, you will be able to use those links. So as Ben mentioned, we want to begin here first by discussing what is energy storage. So very broadly, energy storage enables the storage of power for later use. The idea being that customers would pull from the grid and store electricity when it is less expensive and less polluting to do so, and then use that energy or discharge the battery when it would be most expensive for the customer to be getting their energy from the grid, or when the grid could be overly stressed and turning to polluting peaker plants to satisfy system-wide demands. Energy storage encompasses a broad technology base. Many of these technologies are experiencing declining costs, and especially lithium-ion batteries. Energy storage is controllable and instantly deployable, which adds to its value as one of the more flexible distributed energy resources out there in the marketplace. Just want to point out this topmost photo we have here on the slide. This is an energy installation over at Marcus Garvey in Brooklyn. Marcus Garvey is a 600-unit multifamily building, and this storage container is about 10 feet by 10 feet by 30 feet, and it holds approximately 1 megawatt of energy storage. So this is a relatively big installation, and for a lot of the applications we'll be talking about today, and that you as developers and service providers would be servicing, likely the installations would be smaller. But storage is modular, and it could come in many different shapes and sizes, but we just wanted to provide that context here. We know it can be hard to conceptualize how a battery works, so we're going to use a coffee pot analogy to break things down here a bit. There are three factors that together determine a storage system's total capacity and duration: the battery's kWh, its kW, and its inverter. A battery's kWh is like the capacity of the coffee pot. There's a finite amount of what can be put in, and you can only go so long taking from the pot or from the system before you need to refill it or to charge it. A battery's nameplate kW is like the pot's spout, which determines the maximum amount of coffee or energy that can leave the pot or system at any given time. A battery's inverter can be compared to the pot's tap. The tap controls the speed at which the coffee comes out of the pot, much like the inverter controls the speed with which the storage system charges or discharges at any given moment. Coffee can be released from the pot at both variable and constant rates. And again, there's only so much time you can take coffee from the pot before you have to refill it, all of which is true for energy storage as well. So what does this mean for an energy storage system installed at a customer site? In front of us on the slide here, we have the average load or demand profile for a large office building on a summer weekday. We can see the building's demand begins to ramp up around 6 a.m., shortly before the business day begins. The building demand then peaks at 1 p.m. at approximately 1,254 kW and begins to taper off towards 6 p.m. as occupants leave for the day. Thankfully, our large office building here has installed a storage system, and that storage system is used to shave its peak at the top here and bring the peak kW from 1,254 to approximately 1,133 kW. So as we continue our discussion here, it's critical, essentially, to understand that it is this reduction in peak demand that enables customers to generate savings or revenues with an energy storage system, and we will for sure talk more about that. So today our focus, as Ben said, is going to be on the value proposition of energy storage at customer sites, which are most often referred to as customer-sited or behind-the-meter systems. A major benefit energy storage can yield is a monetary one. Energy storage can help reduce operating costs through energy bill reductions. Customer-sited systems can also bolster resiliency at a site, powering critical loads at a facility to allow for safe evacuations during natural disasters, or a source of power to start up other emergency generation resources. Energy storage enables a customer's participation in demand response as well, which provides grid-level system reliability and further revenues for the customer. Paired with renewables like solar, storage can be used to alleviate the intermittency of renewables and can be configured to power critical loads for extended periods of time. So, one of the biggest value streams storage can provide to a customer is from demand reduction or peak shaving. We really like this graphic, which was designed by our friends over at the Clean Energy Group. We believe it really nicely illustrates the concept of peak shaving. So here we have Building A and Building B. Building A could be an industrial site that runs its production 24 hours a day, giving it a steady electric profile. Building B might be a large secondary school, using substantially less electricity during the morning and evening hours, but spiking midday when students are in school. We can see that clearly Building A is consuming more energy or more kWh than the school, but because the school has a midday spike in consumption, they end up having the same peak demand as the industrial building. That's shown here by this red line here. So even though Building A and Building B are consuming different amounts of energy, they will be paying the same in demand charges. In scenario 2, the school building has elected to install an energy storage system, which charges during the morning hours when the building's demand is lowest. When demand spikes midday, the energy storage system discharges to offset the spike or to shave that peak in energy demand. As a result, the school building has lowered its peak demand threshold and ultimately its demand charge on its electricity bill. So to really understand what kind of savings come from a reduction in peak demand, we're going to take a quick step back and first discuss how customers are charged for electricity. As many are aware, electric customers can be charged for both their energy usage, reflected in kWh, and demand, reflected in kW. In New York State's deregulated energy market, customers can but are not required to purchase their electric supply from their distribution utility. They can choose instead to use an energy service company or an ESCO. In serving their customers, both ESCOs and distribution utilities incur costs associated with supplying their customers' energy needs and meeting each customer's demand at any one moment. Because of this, both a customer's electric supplier and distribution utility can charge for energy and demand. Energy and demand charges imposed by suppliers are called supply charges. Those are the charges we have here highlighted in orange in the table. And charges imposed by distribution utilities are called delivery charges, which are highlighted in blue on the right side of the table. Usually, customers can see the breakdown of charges on their electricity bills. The example bill we have here is for a customer that purchases their electric supply from Con Edison. So, as the customer supplier and distribution utility, we can see here that Con Ed is charging for both supply and delivery, with energy and demand charges broken out within supply and delivery. If this customer purchased their supply from an ESCO, their utility bill might include a paragraph directing them to see their ESCO bills for a breakdown of their supply charges. It's important to note that even though the customer has an ESCO, they're still being charged for delivery by the utility. The utility is still delivering them energy, so they will still charge them for that delivery. There's actually considerable variation in how ESCOs and distribution utilities calculate their supply charges, which makes it somewhat difficult to predict how an energy storage system could reduce those charges. So today our focus will largely be on delivery charges, which are defined in the distribution utilities tariff. Fabulous. Okay, so I just want to take a small pause here and prepare everyone for what's about to happen. So now we're getting into the good stuff. We're going to jump into a discussion about delivery charges or rates, which again are defined on a utility's rates document. It's important to have this discussion when we're talking about energy storage because the savings a customer can derive from peak shaving and how a customer might otherwise operate their battery is closely related to their electric rate. Part of what's so exciting about storage is that there are many different ways a storage system can peak shave and obtain other values. These value streams exist currently, and essentially as we speak, the Public Service Commission is working to define additional further value streams. Often what a customer can save or will be able to save is going to be site-specific and vendor-specific. So as Ben alluded to before, our discussion here isn't meant to be exhaustive or a be-all, end-all explanation of how peak shaving works, but rather a foundation for how peak shaving can be thought about or can be modeled. We're going to dive into the weeds a bit, but if there's any confusion, don't forget ERS and NYSERDA's other energy storage contractors provide technical assistance for this exact reason, to help developers and customers understand the value they can derive from the energy storage system. We'll be sharing our contact information at the end of the presentation, so absolutely do not hesitate to reach out to us. All right, and with that, let's dive into rates here. For our purposes today, we're going to be using Con Edison's rate structures as the basis for our discussions, but for the most part, the fundamentals of these rates are quite similar across New York State's utilities. So, most large electric customers are on what's called a monthly or a monthly time of use rate. Within both of these rates, demand charges are based upon the peak demand reached during each demand window throughout the month or the billing period. Con Edison's monthly rate has only one demand window, which encompasses all hours, all days, all seasons. That's the demand window we see here on the left-hand side of the slide in blue. For a standard monthly customer, demand charges are calculated by multiplying the peak demand reached over that demand window within the billing period by the demand charge assigned to that window. That's what we have down here in our rate calculation. Peak demand multiplied by the demand charge assigned to that window. In this case, of course, we only have one window. Time of use rates, as shown in the graph on the right, differ in that there are 2 to 3 demand windows depending upon the month. But demand is calculated in the same way it would be under a monthly rate. At the end of the billing period, Con Edison reads the meter to determine the peak demand reached during each demand window. Those peak KW values are multiplied by each respective window's demand charge and summed to get a building's total demand charges for the month. Monthly and time of use rates also include a charge for kWh, which are based upon total kWh consumption. Utilities also have a standby rate, which is only applicable to customers with an on-site generation resource or a storage system. The standby rate also has various demand windows, and each are assigned separate charges. But unlike monthly and time of use rates, a customer on a standby rate is charged for demand on a daily rather than a monthly basis. So under standby, the peak demand reached during each demand window in each day is multiplied by the demand charge assigned to each window. Those charges are then added to all of the other demand charges accrued by the customer during every weekday in the month. Also, unlike monthly and time of use rates, standby rates do not include a demand window that spans all hours, all days, no matter the month. Demand is calculated only during weekdays over demand windows that span between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. Finally, standby rates do not have kWh components, but they do include a contract demand charge, or a charge based upon the facility's potential annual peak demand. Utilities impose this charge as a somewhat of an insurance policy, so that if the customer's on-site generator does not perform as expected, the utility can provide the demand to the facility that the system temporarily cannot. So just to provide a recap here, on a monthly or time of use rate, customers are charged for demand on a monthly basis, whereas on a standby rate, demand is assessed on a daily basis. Monthly and time of use rates have demand windows that encompass all hours of all days, no matter the season, no matter the month, whereas on a standby rate, a customer will only be charged for peaks in demand that they hit on weekdays between 8 a.m. and 10 p.m. Monthly and time of use rates include a kWh delivery charge, while standby rates have a contract demand charge. And lastly, in order to switch to the standby rate, customers must have energy storage or an on-site generation resource. So now we're going to take a look at how these aspects of each rate would impact how a customer might operate their battery and the kind of demand charge savings they could achieve through peak shaving. Great. So our example customer here is our old friend, big office building. The graphs show the building's average hourly load profile on 3 weekdays during the summer months. For our purposes, we're going to assume the 3 days shown here are what make up the entire billing period. So we're pretending here we have a 3-day billing period as opposed to a 30-day billing period, just to simplify things. This customer is also on a time of use rate. The rate structure we're using here is Con Edison's Service Classification 9, Rate 3, just for those following along with the math down below. So here, days 1 and 2 are relatively routine for the building during the summer. Demand peaks around midday between 1250 and 1275 average kW. Then, on day 3, the area experiences a heat wave and there's a spike in electric demand in the building. On that day, demand reaches 1460 kW. We can see that up here. We can see that up here. Alrighty. Because of the building's load profile, its peak is coincident with all 3 demand windows. So the peak demand of 1460 kW will be multiplied by each respective window's assigned charges and summed to get total demand charges. It's important to note here that even though average demand throughout the majority of the billing period was less than its peak demand, this ultimately does not matter on a time of use rate. The building is still charged for its peak demand, and in this case would pay around $68,000 in delivery charges. Please hold. Technical difficulties. Alrighty. In this next scenario, the office building now has a 250 kW, 1 megawatt-hour battery installed. So we're again assuming here the 3 days shown make up an entire summertime billing period and that the customer is still on that time of use rate. This time we have depicted in dark orange dotted lines the building's new load profile as a result of the battery charging and discharging. On each day, the battery is charged over a few hours in the early morning and discharged during the day to shave the building's peak. The battery is able to shave an average of 125 kW from the peak each day of the billing period, but peak demand is still set on day 3 due to the spike in outdoor temperature and electric usage in the building. Running the battery on days 1 and 2 did not provide the customer with any value, but in theory, because there's no real way to predict what your building's usage is going to be day to day into the future, it's definitely in the customer's interest to run the battery on those first few days of the billing period. If we had a regular 30-day billing period here, and these were the first 3 days of the month, perhaps after the 3rd day, the customer would configure the battery to begin discharging only when demand was approaching, say, 1400 kW as opposed to 1100 kW, so the customer might not need to run the battery as much throughout the month. But ultimately, there could be some days on a monthly or time of use rate where a customer runs their battery and doesn't necessarily get much value from it. So in this case, this new peak of 1,325 kW is much lower than the previous scenario where we had a peak of 1,460 kW, and the customer is able to spend approximately $6,000 less on their delivery charges than they would have without a battery. So what if this customer had been on a standby rate? We'll take the same customer, same 250 kW, 1 megawatt-hour battery installed, but this time on a standby rate. This time, we're going to assume that this 3-day pattern repeated itself over all the weekdays throughout the month-long billing period. This will allow us to make an apples-to-apples comparison between the customer's demand charges under the time of use and standby rates. I'm going to say that actually one more time here. So we're assuming that this 3-day usage pattern repeats itself every 3 weekdays throughout the month-long billing period, so that we're not comparing daily demand charges for 3 days versus what a customer would pay for an entire month on time of use. For anybody following the math down below, that's why we have our demand charges for each weekday multiplied here by 8. Because we'll assume that this billing period has around 24 weekdays, which is the absolute most a month could really ever have. So we're trying to be conservative here. So here again, we see the battery being charged over the first few hours in the early morning and discharged midday to shave the building's peak. The battery is able to shave an average of 125 kW from the peak of each day of the billing period. Because the customer is on a standby rate in this scenario, every kW shaved brings value for the customer. When on the time of use rate, it didn't quite matter that the customer had peak shaved on days 1 and 2 because day 3 set a higher peak. But on standby, the customer is able to get value from peak shaving on all weekdays, including days 1 and 2. In this case, the customer would save approximately $12,000 on their delivery charges compared to what they'd be charged without a battery on a time of use rate. In early 2018, early last year, Con Ed launched a standby rate pilot called Rider Q. Rider Q's structure is similar to a standby rate, with a major difference being the second demand window. Under regular standby rates, the second demand window is 10 hours long and spans from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. for all customers. Under Rider Q, the window is shortened to a 4-hour block that coincides with the peak of the Con Edison electric network the customer falls within. So on the slide here, we have a map of Con Edison's electric networks in Westchester. And if customers that fall within the blue networks with white dots would be assigned the 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. demand window if they were to switch to Rider Q, while customers in the orange networks would be assigned a demand window from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., etc. The graph, the bottommost graph we have on the slide here shows the demand windows that would be assigned to a customer that falls within a network that peaks between 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. In aligning the second demand window to the customer's network peak, Con Edison is incentivizing customers to reduce their demand or peak shave when the distribution grid is usually most stressed. In this way, customers are incentivized to peak shave when that demand in reduction is most needed and brings the most value to the system as a whole, while also benefiting the customer. Also, with a shorter demand window, a customer's battery doesn't have to run as long in order to shave a peak over an entire demand window. That means demand reductions on Rider Q could be deeper and more easily achieved depending upon a customer's load profile and demand window. So we've talked a lot about electric rate here, but rate is one of a number of factors that can impact peak shaving and battery operation. Another one of those factors is a customer's load profile and peak duration. So here on the left, again, we have our large office building, and on the right, we have a demand profile for a large multifamily building. The multifamily building's load profile is fairly typical. We see a spike in usage in the morning when people are preparing for the day, then a drop when people have left for the day, off to work and school, and a much larger increase in usage and demand in the evenings from when people are coming home to when they go to sleep. Note that both buildings peak at 1,254 kW, and both are on the time of use rate. If the same size battery was installed at both buildings, and in this case we're modeling a 250 kW 1 megawatt hour battery, we can see that the batteries achieve different peak demand reductions. The office building's peak becomes 1,133 kW, while the multifamily buildings becomes, on average, 1,064 kW. Even though these buildings have the same peak kW and have installed the same size battery, because the length of the office building's peak is longer than that of the multifamily building, it must discharge for longer in order to peak shave. This means it can discharge only in smaller kW increments than the multifamily building battery can. And this, of course, results in less of a kW reduction. So this is reminiscent of our coffee analogy. So say, and you'll have to indulge me here, say we have 2 coffee mugs that can carry the same amount of coffee, but one is actually much wider than the other. Here are our coffee mugs. And I'll get my coffee color here. If we filled each mug with the same finite amount of coffee, the skinnier mug would appear much fuller. So here's the same amount of coffee in both the mugs. This is essentially what we have happening here above in our graphs when dealing with the building's peak duration. Thank you for the indulgence there. Alrighty, so certainly we've talked a lot here about peak shaving, but demand response is another very significant value stream energy storage can provide. Through demand response programs, utilities and the New York Independent System Operator, or NYSO, offer payments to building operators to reduce building demand during periods when the transmission or distribution grids could be overloaded. In other words, through DR programs, customers get compensated for the system benefit their reduction in demand provides. Buildings can elect to reduce demand in a number of ways, including ramping down air conditioning, shutting off elevator banks or escalators, or reducing power usage in other ways. A building can also participate in demand response with a battery, using energy stored in the battery to power loads in the building rather than pulling from the grid during the event. This allows a building to maintain normal building operations and tenant comfort while capitalizing on DR revenue. So together, peak shaving and demand response form what's called a value stack. Both are values that a customer with energy storage can take advantage of. Stacking these two values can be an intricate process, however. Because a battery is a finite resource, when DR events are called, customers will have to choose between participating in DR or getting revenues from peak shaving. This will often depend on the customer's electric rate, their load profile, and their geographic location. Ultimately, if a customer is on a monthly rate, foregoing peak shaving to participate in DR can mean setting a monthly peak. So a customer will have to decide whether it would be more valuable to peak shave or do DR on a month-to-month basis. Customers on a standby rate, on the other hand, can make this decision on a daily basis because doing DR would mean compromising only one day of demand charge reductions. Alrighty, and with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Ben Falber, and he's going to talk about some of the financial and technical assistance available for energy storage.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Sammy, for that explanation. One thing I should probably say off the top here is our incentive programs are technology agnostic. You probably noticed that sort of built into a lot of these assumptions, we were looking at electrochemical systems doing targeted peak shaving. The vast majority of small-scale distributed storage in terms of capacity right now in New York is in fact thermal storage, where you're looking at maybe an ice storage system offsetting an electric chiller, something like that. But these sorts of systems are eligible within our program. I think it just goes back to sort of the universe of technologies, the universe of use cases that can really be addressed when you're talking about energy storage in general, but this is sort of a very targeted explanation, though we expect it to be very widely applicable and scalable. So just talk about what NYSERDA is offering at the moment in terms of incentives. We have our PV plus storage incentive. This is a storage adder in the New York Sun program. It's $350 per kWh up to the first 4 hours. So if you kind of think back to the explanation before, if you're not as familiar with power capacity versus energy capacity, when you say a 4-hour system, if you look at a 100 kW system, that's 400 kWh in energy capacity. That's a 4-hour system because it could operate at 4 hours at full capacity. It's currently available for demand metered customers, for community solar projects. If it's behind the meter or customer sited, the customer needs to pay into the SBC. Residential eligibility is in development. Long Island availability is in development. And these projects would be fully under a participating contractor in the New York Sun program. So the New York Sun participating contractor is the one that would get paid by NYSERDA, receive the incentive, and be fully responsible for the project. So the next item here is our FlexTech program. So some of you might be familiar with this already. Essentially, this is funding for feasibility studies. So essentially, it's feasibility studies to do the very thing that we've talked about on this webinar. Really looking at the economics, we'll fund 75% of study costs up to $100,000, commercially available technology only, and we're really looking for projects that are doing either load management or grid services. And when I say load management, that's on the customer side, reducing their bill. Grid services, that's when we're starting to get into DR or utility contracts. The last thing I'll note here is that, especially for customers that are not 500 kW or above in their peak load, it's very likely that they do not have 15-minute interval data. That kind of data on their load, that kind of granularity on their load data is very useful for modeling storage systems because it can be a very precise endeavor. Data logging is a fundable first step under the FlexTech program. The retail storage incentive program, there's another component here that will likely be released either by the end of this quarter or sometime next quarter. This would be for either storage installed alone or retrofitting an existing PV system. A lot of its structure is similar to that storage adder to the New York Sun program, $350 per kWh, at least initially, as designed, and declining. And these incentives are meant to decline out to 2025, available to SBC ratepayers statewide, 5 megawatts or less. And on the question of DR or charging requirements, we, at least designed at this stage, we do highly encourage providing grid benefits, but it's not currently designed in the program. But some of these items are still subject to change as we go through the approval process with TPS and until this ultimately does get released. But we still encourage you to get excited about it and start thinking about it. Here's a few other details here. It would be 100% of the incentive for the first 4 hours of duration, and then it drops to 50% of the incentive for hours 5 and 6, 0% thereafter. Designed with a single milestone payment. We'll look for a couple of years of interval data reporting. We're looking for a 10-year warranty for UL listings, minimum round-trip efficiency of 70%. And we will have a quality assurance and M&V process until track records are established by participating storage contractors in our program, and then it'll be sort of spot checked after that. I'll stop there in terms of heavy amounts of detail, but if you're really looking to get a much deeper look into the design of this program, feel free to reach out to me. Lastly, I won't run through this in too much detail. This is more of a reference for when you download this slide deck later. We just provided, for your convenience, a bunch of links to take you to the kinds of resources that we're citing throughout the webinar.
Great. Thanks so much, Ben. So quickly, we want to provide a recap of kind of all the things we just spoke about. It's good to know that a variety of facilities can see benefits from a behind-the-meter storage system. At this point, value is typically derived from demand charge reduction and demand response participation. And the PSC, the Public Service Commission, the New York Independent System Operator, and utilities, alongside NYSERDA and other industry partners, are focused on creating additional value streams and enhancing those that do already exist, such as export to the grid through VEDR and pairing energy storage with renewables. Peak shaving savings are closely related to a customer's electric rate and will be site-specific and location-specific. And, of course, don't forget, technical assistance is available. If you do have any questions, if you as a developer or a vendor are serving your clients, ERS is here to support you in providing that value to your clients and to explore cost-free, because it's paid for by NYSERDA, the potential at a high level for energy storage at your client's facilities and at a customer facility. So here we have our energy storage email address and a few other links that could be of use. I just want to remind everybody on the line, if you are interested in obtaining AIA credit, please do email Tracy Hall with your AIA number in the subject line, Energy Storage Webinar, AIA Credit Request. We'll be distributing these slides with this information shortly, and you also had a reminder email yesterday that includes this information. All right, and with that, we have just over 10 minutes for some questions. So we're going to see what we have here in our questions panel. Alrighty, so we're going through some of the questions here, and they keep coming in. Will a recording of the webinar be sent out and accessible? Absolutely. Are there publicly available models for electric rate calculations? If you want to,
So there is the value stack calculator. If we could circulate a link to that value stack calculator, and it actually might be one of the links on the slide. I actually don't recall at the moment, but yeah, if you Google VEDR value stack calculator in New York Sun, you will find a Excel chart basically that you can use that's been programmed to model different value streams. It's actually getting a bit of an update to be a little bit more user-friendly at the moment, and that'll be coming out sometime in the coming months. And ARS also has a model that we use when we do technical assistance for customers.
Great. Thanks, Ben. What about using storage in NYSO? So we touched upon it briefly at the end here. The New York Independent System Operator does run a number of different demand response programs, and energy storage at the moment can participate in the NYSO's Special Case Resource Program and derive value out of that DR program.
The other thing I'll say on that is we've really been focused on retail storage in this webinar. We are developing a bulk storage incentive program, and there's a lot of work that we're doing with the NYSO at the moment for these more large-scale front-of-the-meter type storage systems that would be actually directly interacting on the supply side of the NYSO market. At least for the purposes of this webinar today, we're really not going to hit any detail, but there will be further resources that NYSERDA will put out on that subject.
Thanks, Ben. So we were asked about showing the business case for the example where the facility saved $12,000 per month on their delivery charges. As Ben mentioned, we here at ERS are always available to work with you to use your building or your customer's building's usage data to determine the savings as it would apply to the building, and then draw out the business case. So absolutely, we're here to help, and you can reach out to us at energystorage@ers-inc.com. We have a question, is the $350 per kWh incentive available to storage-only projects?
Yeah, so for storage installed alone, that would be fundable under the incentive program that we intend to release either the end of this quarter or next quarter, pending DPS approval of that incentive program.
Great. So we also have a question. So is peak load shaving the main monetizable value of storage in New York State today? We are seeing that peak shaving is definitely a considerable value stream, and if that can be stacked with demand response, that value stack does derive a lot of value from your storage system. There are definitely other value streams that exist and are being enhanced currently through the VETR process, the Rev VETR process, and through other Public Service Commission undertakings.
The other thing I'll mention there is that if you were to look at that map on the various storage systems installed in New York, you would see a lot of them are installed as a result of utilities actually procuring resources to offset what we would call a traditional infrastructure investment by installing DERs. And that was actually where the Marcus Garvey project that we had cited came out of. So that is also a major driver for storage right now in New York.
So we had a question here about permitting for lithium-ion batteries. There currently is a guideline for outdoor lithium-ion installations in New York City, and the question was about whether indoor installations have happened and what the process is like.
So on indoor installations, as far as New York City goes, indoor installations have not been permitted. We're working closely with New York City authorities and agencies to move that process forward. And we'll continue to devote our resources to that effort.
Great. PON 1746, is it only for existing buildings or does it apply for new construction as well?
All right. At this point, it only applies for new buildings, for existing buildings, I'm sorry. For new construction, shoot me a note. Let me know what you're thinking. It would have to kind of be case by case. We'd have to think about how we're evaluating the projected demand at the building and if it makes sense to be sizing the storage system up front or to actually size it for an existing building. So we could just take that offline.
With regard to the incentive, one of the slides talked about the no clawback. Can you talk a bit more about what that would mean?
what that was saying was, as currently designed, the incentive payment is provided after completion of our quality assurance, which would be site inspection for health and safety, compliance with program rules. Then the actual performance of the system would come after that payment. And it's not as though if the system isn't fully optimized that we would necessarily claw back the money. It's more that if it's not fully optimized, we keep that in mind for how we evaluate future projects and try to work with you as much as possible to figure out what might be happening if certain value streams aren't being attained as much as they could be.
Are the incentives listed applicable to the Long Island service territory?
So the Long Island incentives, because customers there don't pay into the SBC fund, we are developing a Long Island program that would be funded with RGGI funds. I don't have too much to say about it at this point, but I would encourage anyone thinking about energy storage in Long Island to look at LIPA's Utility 2.0 plan. They have some interesting programs going on with demand charges for customers and demand charge management for residential customers. So take a look at that. It's likely that if we did have a program, it would interact with what's currently detailed in their LIPA 2.0 plan. Skip it.
Does the NYSERDA map of storage locations include both front of the meter and behind the meter?
Yeah, it includes everything except pumped hydro.
Fabulous. Do the federal investment tax credits apply to the cost of storage? A, if connected to solar, and B, if not connected to solar. So the federal ITC is right now mainly for solar, but there was a storage adder incentive added, and which can only be achieved if the storage system is installed alongside a solar PV system. That storage system would also need to be charged by the solar system for the majority of the time in order for the incentive to apply to the storage system.
Talk to your tax lawyer. This is not the state giving you tax advice.
Yes. So we have one last question here, and we also want to thank everyone for joining us. We have a question about the timeline. How will this incentive be evaluated, and how long will it take?
So the incentive, so for the New York Sun storage adder incentive, the details are really laid out in that program manual. So you would have to really just be in compliance with New York Sun program rules to receive the incentive. For the upcoming one that's currently in design, essentially we would be looking for the sizing information, customer information, site plan, design drawing, cost of the storage system, and and the use case, and we would take that all together and evaluate what's been proposed. As far as the turnaround time, it will vary depending on what you give us and if everything is completed and there's enough detail in there to approve the system.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thank you very much to Tracy at USGBC New York Upstate. Thanks for joining us today, and we hope to connect with all of you in the near future about energy storage. Thanks all. Have a good one.